Eminent Chancellor, President Sylvester, colleagues, fellow degree and certificate recipients, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by thanking the University of St. Michael's College on behalf of Sister Mechtild and myself for the honor they are bestowing on us today. I can't help but add a special word for Professor Michael O'Connor. He was so kind. He brought me to tears. In the next few moments, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about a certain period in my life, an abbreviated account, as it were, and the impact that the Second Vatican Council had on it. One could say that what I'm going to say represents the experience of one priest who has grown up and been ordained in the pre-conciliar church, was caught up in the drama of the council, and who then tried to find his way through the polarizing tensions of the post-conciliar church. In June of 1962, I was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Toronto at St. Michael's Cathedral. In October of that same year, the bishops from around the world gathered in Rome for the first formal session of the Council. As a student of the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome from 1963 to 1965, I was able to witness at close hand the second and third sessions, which made up half of the Council's meetings. Important issues of real significance for the life and future of the Church were discussed and debated, sometimes with considerable passion. I was struck by the clash of ideas and by the intensity with which individual bishops, as well as national and other groups, defended their convictions on a range of issues. As young priests, I and others were able to meet and to hear lectures from some of the most influential theologians at the Council. We were able to talk with some of the Canadian bishops who were taking part in it. I remember once having lunch with Archbishop, later Cardinal Flaff of Winnipeg, and his comments on the efforts of a minority to block the Council from producing a document on the Church's relation to the Jews and to Judaism. The conflict between what the media called the progressive or liberal element and the conservative wing of the bishops on this issue was reflected in the debates of almost all the major themes addressed by the Council. That tension was very much in evidence during the discussion of the issues which would feed into Gaudium et Spes, the document on the Church in the modern world. The progressive wing itself, represented on the one hand by the French bishops and on the other by the Germans and the other German-speaking bishops, began to split. A visible expression of this was the decision after the Council by a number of progressive theologians to create Concilium, an international theological journal. They saw it as carrying forward the thoughts and concerns of the more progressive wing of the Council. Before long, a second journal, Communio, was launched by Hans-Urs von Balthasar, Joseph Ratzinger, and others. The two publications reflected the polarization that was becoming entrenched in the Church and in theology. After completing the license in Scripture, I received permission from Archbishop Pocock to pursue doctoral studies in theology at Münster in Germany. The topic I wanted to study had personal significance for me. It had to do with the language of priesthood and what it would mean when applied to the Christian ministry. The Council of Trent, and in keeping with it, the theology I learned at Le Grand Séminaire in Quebec City, focused almost exclusively on the language of priesthood when speaking of the ministry. At the Biblicum, I discovered that in the New Testament, priestly language was used of Christ and of the community of faith, but not of the ordained ministry. My desire at this point was to understand how we got from the one to the other and what it meant for me as a recently ordained priest. I spoke to Karl Rahner about a possible dissertation, who then put me in touch with Joseph Ratzinger, saying that he was interested in precisely this question. One of the more delightful memories from this period was meeting with Ratzinger in Salzburg and eating ice cream in an outdoor cafe, deciding exactly what it was would be the focus of my thesis. The tensions and conflicts which were so much a part of the experience of the council continued and in some way intensified after the council had ended. For people who were unaware of the theological and biblical renewal that had been going underway in many European countries in the previous decades, the council and its documents seemed all but incomprehensible. Some thought that the bishops were undermining the fundamental aspects of traditional Catholic faith and practice. A key to understanding the council and its relation to the broader history of the Church was the modernist crisis of 1890 to 1910, and the way in which theologians like de Lubac, Congar, and Rahner were able in their different ways to go beyond it. As a result of their work, my sense of the council was one of considerable continuity in the midst of undeniable discontinuity. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Church found itself, especially in Western culture, facing a dramatic challenge as large numbers of priests, religious, and sisters began leaving the priesthood and their communities. Even more challenging was the sudden and considerable drop in the number of those entering seminaries and religious communities. Something that struck me at the time was the fact that people offered very different explanations for the vocational decisions they were making. Some priests said they left the ministry because the church was no longer the church in which they had been ordained. Others said the opposite. For them, change was coming too slowly. The council was both a point of arrival and a point of departure. It brought forward an initial fulfillment to the renewal efforts that had preceded it and made it possible and provided the church and church people with tools for further renewal and adaptation in the face of a radically and rapidly changing world. I always thought that the council was a wonderful gift for people like myself. I was raised in Toronto in what was a kind of Catholic ghetto, largely Irish and lower middle and working class. We tended to focus on ourselves and our hopes and concerns. Secularism, with its abandonment of religious values and practices, and a host of other social and intellectual developments have changed our sense of what it is to be a Catholic and a Christian in the contemporary world. The Council has taught us new ways of living our faith today. It has encouraged us, for example, to be open to and willing to collaborate with other Christians, as well as with Jews, Muslims, representatives of other religious traditions. Papal encyclicals used to be addressed to Catholics, especially to bishops. St. John the 23rd, Pacem in Terris of 1963, most encyclicals have been directed to the Church as a whole, as well as to people of goodwill. Pope Francis addresses the encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home to everyone. With it, he says, I would like to enter into dialogue with all people about our common home, the earth. The renewal called for by the Council is many-faceted, and in some cases so radical that we were naive to think that it could be achieved in a short time. I have no doubt that the Council will continue to be a guide, a source of hope, and a challenge to the Church for decades to come. even an abbreviated version of my story, has to include something about what everyone calls St. Mike's. I was here initially between 1954 and 1958 as an undergraduate, then since 1971 as a teacher. On returning from Europe, I taught for 4 years at St. Augustine's Seminary, at the end of which it was decided that I did not really fit in with the seminary's plans for the future. I then approached St. Michael's and the Basilian Fathers about the possibility of living and working here. Father John Kelly, the president, Father Elliot Allen, the dean of theology, Father Bob Madden, the local superior, were incredibly gracious and welcoming to me. I owe them, and the Basilian Fathers in general, a great debt of gratitude. As I think of St. Michael's and how much I've received from it, I have to mention one course from my undergraduate years. The professor was Father Gerald B. Phelan, a diocesan priest from Halifax. The course was entitled The Philosophy of Art. The required reading included the recently published Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry by Jacques Maritain. Although I found much of Maritain very difficult to understand, there was something about the book and about Phelan and his teaching of it that made a powerful impression on me. That impact was reinforced and increased by a love of the visual arts that blossomed in me during my 4 years in Europe. Over the last 40 or more years, I've been able to put together a substantial collection of modern and contemporary Canadian art, which I've donated to St. Michael's. I have become increasingly convinced that the visual arts have an important role to play not only in our culture as a whole, but also in our universities, a role analogous to that played by music and literature. My involvement in the art world brought me into contact with artists, art dealers, and others who had a real appreciation and love for the visual arts. My contacts with such people, along with the development of the collection, have been for me a source of joy and insight. The openness with which I have approached contemporary art was largely inspired by the attitude to the world, which I found in Gaudium et Spes. It was also influenced by my study of Karl Rahner, his conviction that the world, in spite of all that is negative and destructive in it, is a world permeated by grace. All this challenged me to seek out the deeper human and divine dimensions of created reality and of creative artists. One of the last courses I taught is a fourth-year seminar entitled Vatican II, Then and Now. It provided me with the opportunity to reread the Council's documents and to reflect with students about where we stand today in regard to the Council and its reception. The post-conciliar period witnessed a real effort to see the teaching of the Council implemented and in many cases updated and made fruitful. One need only think of the renewal of the liturgy, especially of the rituals of the Mass or the Eucharist. I regard it as an extraordinary gift to the whole Church. It has helped me to make the Eucharist so central in my life. I've already mentioned the importance of Nostra Aetate, the declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions. This document has dramatically and definitively changed the relation of the Church, initially to Jews and increasingly to Muslims. In this area, the Council began a process that subsequent popes and theologians have carried a great deal further. Something analogous can be said about Christian ecumenism. Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, and the debates surrounding it have helped people to realize that Christian moral life is not just about personal integrity, but also about the great issues of the contemporary world. Issues like peace, justice, poverty, refugees, and climate change. In these and other areas, we can see how the conciliar teaching has been received, adapted, and made fruitful. Central to the council was the document on the church, Lumen Gentium. To some extent, it shifted the focus from the institutional aspects of the church to its human and religious reality. The document and the council as a whole emphasized the role of the laity. Without their active involvement in all aspects of the life and mission of the church, it will not be able to confront successfully the challenges that face it in our culture. The importance of this, and especially of the role of women, has become increasingly clear with the passing years. We've seen it here again today. St. Michael's has made a real contribution to furthering the role of women, and especially of the sisters, especially through the Faculty of Theology. I recall the many sisters and laywomen whose graduate dissertations I directed. Their commitment, in spite of opposition, and their achievements have been an inspiration for me, and I'm sure for everyone in the faculty. A month ago, Pope Francis celebrated the 60th anniversary of the opening of the council. He praised it and reaffirmed its teaching, even as he lamented the polarization that has come to mark the life of the contemporary church, as well as much of contemporary society. To counteract it, we need to reaffirm our faith in the dignity of all people and to learn again to listen respectively to others, especially to those with whom we disagree. May God free us, the Pope said, from being critical and intolerant, harsh and angry. Although the Council has not had the last word on the many manifold topics it addressed, it has given us tools for which I, for one, am deeply grateful. I am convinced that we will continue to be enriched and challenged by its teaching for years to come.